Racist teacher spills hot coffee on black boy. Not knowing his mother is watching a clumsy, seemingly intentional mistake becomes a turning point for a young boy, with his protective mother ready to intervene. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in room 204 as Mr. Thompson stood before his first period AP U.S. history class. It was 8:15 a.m., and the February sun streamed through the windows, creating sharp rectangles of light on the worn linoleum floor. 28 students sat at their desks, most still fighting the morning drowsiness despite the coffee and energy drinks clutched in their hands. Mr. Thompson, a tall man in his 50s with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, wrote The Civil War, Causes and Consequences on the whiteboard. His pressed khakis and buttoned-up shirt projected the image of authority he'd cultivated over his 15 years at Riverside High. A steaming cup of coffee sat on his desk, next to a stack of ungraded papers. In the front row, Jamal Williams tried to focus on the lesson. His notebook lay open, covered with his neat handwriting, but his mind kept drifting to the college acceptance letter waiting in his email inbox. His mother, Angela, had promised to check it with him after school. As one of the few black students in AP history, Jamal felt an added pressure to excel, a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Through the classroom door's narrow window, Angela Williams conducted her routine observation. As a member of the school's parent-teacher association, she had made it her mission to ensure equal treatment for all students. She watched as her son diligently took notes, pride mixing with concern in her chest. The Civil War, Thompson began, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who delivered this lecture countless times, wasn't just about slavery, as many of you might think. He paced across the front of the room, gesturing with one hand while the other reached absently for his coffee cup. The students shifted in their seats. Aisha Rahman, sitting 2 rows behind Jamal, exchanged a knowing look with him. They discussed how Thompson often seemed to minimize the role of slavery in historical events, presenting what they felt was a sanitized version of history. Thompson continued his lecture, becoming more animated as he spoke about states' rights and economic factors. His movements grew increasingly erratic, his gestures wider. The coffee cup teetered precariously on the edge of his desk. And if you consider the economic implications, Thompson turned sharply, his elbow catching the coffee cup. Time seemed to slow as the cup tipped, its contents arcing through the air in a brown stream. Jamal, focused on his notes, didn't notice until it was too late. The hot coffee splashed across his desk, soaking his notebook and sleeve. The liquid seeped through his white shirt, instantly burning the skin beneath. Jamal's cry of pain shattered the classroom's monotony. Chairs scraped against the floor as students jumped back, creating a circle of space around him. Angela, who had been about to leave, whirled at the sound of her son's voice. Through the window, she saw Jamal clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain. Without hesitation, she pushed the door open and rushed inside. The classroom fell silent. Thompson stood frozen, empty cup still in hand, as Angela reached her son's side. Jamal's right arm was angry red where the coffee had soaked through his shirt. His notebook, containing weeks of careful notes, was ruined, the ink running in coffee-stained rivers across the pages. The other students watched, phones already out, as Angela examined her son's arm. The burn wasn't severe, but the humiliation in Jamal's eyes told a different story. The incident itself might have been an accident, but something in Thompson's hesitate, on to help, in his failure to immediately apologize, suggested deeper issues that had long simmered beneath the surface of Riverside High's polished exterior. Thompson finally moved, grabbing a handful of paper towels from his desk. "I'm sure it's not that bad," he said, his tone dismissive. "These things happen." Those 4 words hung in the air, carrying more weight than perhaps he intended. Angela looked up, her eyes meeting Thompson's. In that moment, what had started as a simple accident began to transform into something more significant. The tension in the room was palpable, a spark about to ignite a much larger flame. The silence in room 204 shattered as Angela rose from her crouched position beside Jamal. Her voice, clear and measured, cut through the tension. These things happen, Mr. Thompson. Like the time you gave Jamal a C on his Civil War paper despite his thorough research, or when you interrupted his class presentation about Frederick Douglass. Students shifted in their seats, phones discreetly recording the confrontation. Thompson's face reddened as he straightened his tie, a nervous habit that betrayed his discomfort. Mrs. Williams, I assure you this was purely accidental. Perhaps we should discuss any other concerns in private. No, Angela interrupted, her hands flat on Jamal's desk. We're going to discuss this right here, where everyone can witness it. I'm tired of these private discussions that lead nowhere. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder in the charged atmosphere. Thompson moved behind his desk, creating a barrier between himself and Angela. This is hardly the appropriate time or place. When is the appropriate time? Angela's voice remained steady, but her eyes blazed. When more students suffer in silence. When more parents have to watch their children's confidence erode because of subtle dismissals and accidents. In the third row, Aisha Rahman raised her hand. Her hijab was deep purple today, matching the determination in her eyes. Mrs. Williams, she called out, not waiting for Thompson's permission to speak. Last month, Mr. Thompson said my paper on Islamic contributions to medieval medicine was too focused on religious perspectives and made me rewrite it. The dam broke. Other students began raising their hands, their voices overlapping. He always calls on the white students first. He told me my English wasn't good enough for AP classes. He suggested I take regular history instead because some students aren't suited for advanced coursework. Thompson's face grew, increasingly pale as the testimonies continued. He tried to regain control of his classroom. That's enough. This is completely inappropriate. No, what's inappropriate is the systematic way you've been undermining these students, Angela countered. She turned to address the class directly. How many of you have felt discriminated against in this classroom? Hands rose slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. Nearly half the class had their hands up, forming a silent but powerful indictment. The students who hadn't raised their hands looked around with dawning recognition, seeing their classroom through new eyes. Jamal, still holding his burned arm, watched as his classmates found their voices. The pain from the coffee began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of vindication. For years, he'd wondered if he was imagining the subtle slights, the dismissive tones, the harder grading. Now, listening to his classmates share similar experiences, he realized he wasn't alone. Aisha stood up, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. Last semester, when we covered the Middle East unit, you spent more time talking about conflicts than our scientific and cultural achievements. When I tried to contribute information from my family's background, you said we needed to stick to the textbook. Thompson attempted to interject, but Angela held up her hand. Mr. Thompson, for once we go to listen. These students have been silenced long enough. The classroom had transformed from a space of quiet submission to one of open dialogue. Students who had never spoken up before found courage in the collective voice rising around them. Even those who hadn't experienced discrimination firsthand began to understand the depth of the problem. A sophomore named Marcus shared how Thompson had suggested he might be more comfortable in regular history despite his 4.0 GPA. Lisa Chun described how her questions about Asian American contributions to railroad construction were consistently deflected. As the stories continued to pour out, Thompson's defense crumbled. His attempts to dismiss the incident as isolated became increasingly hollow. The coffee stain on Jamal's shirt had become a visible symbol of a much deeper stain on the school's educational fabric. Principal Davis sat at the head of the conference room table, his usual confidence notably diminished. The emergency meeting had been called within an hour of the incident, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Vice Principal Martinez frantically took notes while the school board representative, Mrs. Chun, joined via video call on the wall-mounted screen. Let me get this straight, Principal Davis began, running his hands through his thinning hair. We have dozens of students recording testimonies of discrimination, a potential lawsuit brewing, and social media already picking up the story? The last part made him wince. He'd seen the Twitter hashtag Riverside Racism trending locally. The door opened, and Angela Williams entered, her presence commanding immediate attention. She carried a folder thick with documented incidents, collected over months of careful observation. Behind her, 3 other parents from the PTA filed in, representing a diverse cross-section of the school community. "Mr. Davis," Angela began, placing the folder on the table. "What happened today was just the catalyst. We have over 50 documented incidents of discriminatory behavior from Mr. Thompson alone. And he's not the only one." The administration staff exchanged nervous glances as Angela began methodically presenting her evidence. There were grade disparities, documented patterns of classroom participation, and student testimonials dating back 3 years. The preparation behind her presentation made it clear this wasn't just about spilled coffee. Parents began sharing their stories. Mrs. Rodriguez described how her daughter was discouraged from taking AP classes despite her excellent grades. Mr. Kim detailed the subtle ways Asian students were stereotyped in academic expectations. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a comprehensive picture of systemic issues. Principal Davis, initially defensive, found his position increasingly untenable. The evidence was too substantial to dismiss. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, his voice notably more subdued. A student representative, chosen by her peers, was invited in. Sarah Chun, a junior, carried with her a petition signed by over 300 students. "We want mandatory cultural competency training for all staff," she began. "We want a diversity and inclusion committee with actual power to make changes. We want our curriculum reviewed for bias." The school board representative on the video call leaned forward. "These are serious allegations that require immediate action. Principal Davis, what's your plan to address this?" Davis looked around the room, seeing the determined faces of parents and students who wouldn't accept empty promises this time. The political implications were clear. Inaction would be more damaging than any proposed changes. "We'll need to suspend Mr. Thompson, pending an investigation," he started, choosing his words carefully. "But clearly, we need broader systemic changes." He turned to Angela. "Mrs. Williams, would you be willing to head a task force to develop these initiatives?" Angela's response was measured. "Only if we have real authority to implement changes, not just make recommendations that get filed away." The meeting continued for hours, with specific proposals being debated and documented. A framework for immediate action emerged. Thompson would be placed on administrative leave. An external investigator would be brought in to review all discrimination complaints, and a student-parent coalition would be formed to oversee changes. As the meeting drew to a close, Principal Davis made an unprecedented decision. "We need to hold a school-wide assembly," he announced. "Every student deserves to know that we're taking this seriously, and every student deserves a chance to be heard." The significance of this moment wasn't lost on anyone present. What had started as one mother's vigilance had exposed deep-seated issues that could no longer be ignored. As Angela gathered her materials, she caught sight of Jamal waiting outside the conference room, his burned arm now bandaged, but his eyes bright with hope. The following week transformed Riverside High's usually quiet halls into centers of activism. Angela Williams converted the school's unused study hall into an informal command center, with students and parents cycling through during free periods and after school. Posters announcing community action meetings lined the walls, and sign-up sheets for various committees filled quickly. "We need to document everything," Angela instructed a group of parent volunteers. "Every incident, every microaggression, every dismissive comment." She created a digital reporting system, making it easier for students to share their experiences anonymously. The responses were overwhelming, not just about Thompson, but about systemic issues throughout the school. During lunch periods, students began holding informal discussion groups. Aisha emerged as a powerful organizer, coordinating with different cultural clubs to ensure diverse representation. The Muslim Students Association, Black Student Union, Asian American Alliance, and Hispanic Student Organization began working together for the first time in the school's history. Meanwhile, Thompson's response to his temporary removal grew increasingly hostile. From his home, he sent emails to sympathetic parents and school board members, characterizing the movement as oversensitive students manufacturing grievances and radical parents pushing an agenda. During one particularly tense planning session, Angela received screenshots of Thompson's private social media posts, where he mocked the students' testimonies and suggested that certain parents were playing the race card. Rather than responding directly, she added the evidence to her growing documentation. "He's scared," Angela explained to a concerned group of parents. "He's watching his power slip away, and he's reacting exactly as we expected." She used his behavior to illustrate why their approach needed to remain professional and documented. The preparation for the school-wide assembly became a major focus. Students worked on presentations, gathering statistics, and preparing testimonies. Angela ensured that every participant understood the importance of remaining factual and specific. "We're not here to attack individuals," she reminded everyone during a planning session. "We're here to change systems. Every story we tell needs to point to a specific policy or practice that needs to change." The resistance movement wasn't without its challenges. Some teachers, feeling threatened by the scrutiny, became defensive. Anonymous complaints appeared in Principal Davis's inbox, suggesting that the movement was creating a hostile work environment for staff. Angela addressed these concerns head-on in a faculty meeting. "We're not against teachers," she declared. "We're against practices that harm students. Any teacher who's committed to equality and fair treatment has nothing to fear from these changes." As the assembly APPR urged, Thompson's behavior grew more erratic. He began sending late-night emails to students who had spoken against him, suggesting that their college recommendations might suffer. When these emails were forwarded to Angela, she immediately took them to Principal Davis and the school board. The movement's impact extended beyond Riverside's walls. Local news stations picked up the story, and other schools in the district began reaching out to learn from their approach. Angela found herself giving interviews and sharing their documentation methods with other parent groups. "This isn't just about one school," she explained during a community meeting. "This is about changing how we address discrimination in education. Every policy we create here can be a model for other schools." The night before the assembly, Angela stayed late at school, reviewing presentations with student speakers. She found Jamal in the empty cafeteria, practicing his speech. "You don't have to do this," she told him, knowing the pressure he felt as the incident's catalyst. "Yes, I do," he replied, his burned arm now healed, but the memory still fresh. "Someone has to speak first." The school gymnasium hummed with nervous energy as nearly 1,000 students filed in, filling the bleachers and overflow chairs. Principal Davis had made attendance mandatory, and the local news media waited outside, barred from entering to protect student privacy. The air conditioning struggled against the heat of so many bodies, and the tension in the room was palpable. Jamal stood behind the podium, index cards trembling slightly in his hands. The burns on his arm had faded to a dull pink, but he deliberately rolled up his sleeve, making the mark visible. Angela sat in the front row, nodding encouragingly, while Aisha waited nearby with other student speakers. "A month ago," Jamal began, his voice initially quiet but gaining strength, "Mr. Thompson spilled coffee on my arm. That's a fact, but what happened next revealed something bigger than a burn." He paused, looking directly at his classmates. It revealed a pattern that many of us have experienced, but few felt safe enough to discuss. The gymnasium fell silent. Even the usual whispers and rustling of phones ceased as Jamal described years of subtle discrimination. The lower grades on subjective assignments, the interrupted presentations, the dismissive responses to questions about Black historical figures. "This isn't about one incident or one teacher," he continued. "It's about a system that made us doubt ourselves, made us wonder if maybe we just weren't good enough, made us question whether we belonged in AP classes at all." As Jamal finished, Aisha took the podium. She spoke about being asked to represent her entire religion during class discussions, about having her cultural perspectives dismissed as biased, about being told to stick to the textbook when the textbook itself showed bias. One by one, students came forward. A Latino student described being told his English wasn't quite AP level. An Asian American student shared how teachers assumed she would excel in math, but questioned her creative writing abilities. Each story built upon the last, creating a devastating portrait of institutional bias. Principal Davis, watching from the side, visibly paled as the testimonies continued. The school board representatives present shifted uncomfortably in their seats. These weren't vague complaints. They were specific, documented incidents impossible to dismiss. However, not everyone was supportive. A group of students, mostly from families close to Thompson, sat with arms crossed, occasionally rolling their eyes or making dismissive gestures. Some teachers along the wall exchanged knowing looks, clearly skeptical of the proceedings. Then came the moment that changed the assembly's entire tone. Maria Rodriguez, a quiet sophomore rarely noticed in class, approached the podium. Her voice shook as she revealed a series of text messages from Thompson, sent after the coffee incident, warning her to think carefully about participating in the assembly because certain opportunities might become limited. The gymnasium erupted. Even skeptical students sat up straighter. Principal Davis immediately began typing on his phone, likely contacting the school board's legal team. The intimidation attempt had backfired spectacularly, transforming Thompson from a controversial figure to an active threat. As the assembly concluded, Angela took the podium for final remarks. Instead of attacking Thompson or the administration, she focused on the future. Today isn't about punishment, she declared. It's about change. Real, lasting change that ensures every student feels safe, respected, and valued. She outlined specific proposals: curriculum review committees, anonymous reporting systems, mandatory cultural competency training, and regular community feedback sessions. Each point was met with increasing enthusiasm from the students. Unknown to the assembly participants, Thompson watched the live stream from home, his face darkening with each testimony. As Angela concluded her speech, he began composing emails to his lawyer and conservative education advocacy groups, planning his counterattack. Thompson's revenge began subtly, but escalated quickly. Despite being on administrative leave, he still had access to the school's online grading system. Over the weekend, he logged in and systematically altered previous grades for students who had spoken at the assembly. Jamal Zay, in the first quarter, dropped to a C+. Aisha's perfect attendance record suddenly showed 3 unexcused absences. The changes weren't immediately obvious, but Angela had anticipated something like this. She'd taken screenshots of all relevant student records the day after the coffee incident. When parents began calling about mysterious grade changes, she was ready. Document everything. She instructed the affected families during an emergency meeting in her living room. Every changed grade, every altered attendance record, every suspicious modification. 20 parents huddled around her dining table, comparing before and after screenshots on their phones and laptops. But Thompson's retaliation went beyond grade tampering. He began sending emails to college admissions offices where his former students had applied, particularly targeting Jamal and Aisha. The emails, written under the guise of professional concern, subtly questioned their academic integrity and leadership capabilities. "He's trying to poison our futures," Aisha said during a strategy session with other affected students. They gathered in the school library after hours, working with Angela to document and counter each of Thompson's actions. But he doesn't realize we're not acting alone anymore. The students developed a systematic approach to protecting themselves. They created a shared digital folder where they stored screenshots of every communication, every grade change, and every suspicious activity. They recorded dates, times, and witnesses for each incident. What started as defense became a masterclass in documentation and evidence gathering. Meanwhile, Thompson grew bolder. He created an anonymous blog titled The Truth About Riverside, where he posted out-of-context photos and conversations from student social media accounts, attempting to discredit their testimonies. He particularly targeted Jamal, posting old disciplinary records that should have been confidential. "He's getting desperate," Angela observed, reviewing the blog post with the school's legal team. "And he's making mistakes." Each post, each email, each grade change created a clearer pattern of harassment and retaliation. The students refused to be intimidated. Instead, they turned Thompson's actions into evidence for their cause. Jamal and Aisha organized a workshop teaching other students how to protect their online presence and document harassment. They created a secure messaging system for reporting new incidents and coordinating responses. During one particularly tense week, Thompson sent anonymous letters to several parents, threatening to expose personal information about their families if the complaints weren't withdrawn. The letters, printed on plain paper, arrived in unmarked envelopes, but Thompson had made a crucial mistake. He'd used the school's bulk mail permit number. "Keep everything," Angela instructed when parents brought her the letters, hands shaking with anger and fear. "Every envelope, every paper, every postal mark. This isn't just retaliation anymore, it's harassment and blackmail." The students decided to create a video documentary of their experiences, not just with Thompson's recent actions, but with the years of discrimination that led to this point. They conducted interviews, gathered evidence, and compiled a timeline of events that was impossible to dismiss. "We're not just defending ourselves," Jamal explained during a filming session. "We're creating a record so this can't happen to future students." The documentary project became a way to transform their defensive documentation into a powerful offensive tool. The school auditorium was packed tighter than it had ever been for the screening of Voices Unheard, the truth about Riverside High. Parents, students, administrators, and even local media representatives sat shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with anticipation. The documentary, created entirely by students, represented weeks of careful editing and fact-checking. The video opened with security camera footage from the coffee incident, but quickly expanded beyond it. Student testimonials, carefully documented evidence, and a timeline of Thompson's retaliatory actions filled the screen. The production quality wasn't professional, but the raw honesty of the content made it compelling. "We didn't just want to show what happened," Jamal's voice narrated over footage of altered grade records. "We wanted to show why it happened and how the system allowed it to continue for so long." The documentary included statistical analysis of grade distributions, showing clear patterns of bias across years of Thompson's classes. As the video played, the audience's reactions shifted from murmurs to gasps to outright anger. The section revealing Thompson's threatening letters to parents drew audible reactions. When the screen showed his anonymous blog posts targeting students, several parents stood up, demanding immediate action. Principal Davis, watching from the back row, continuously wiped sweat from his forehead. The evidence was damning not just of Thompson, but of an administration that had ignored warning signs for years. The documentary included emails from parents dating back 3 years, reporting concerns that had been dismissed or minimized. The most powerful segment featured Aisha, speaking directly to the camera about the college recommendation sabotage. "He tried to destroy our futures," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "But he taught us something he never intended: how to fight back with truth and evidence." The video concluded with a series of concrete demands: Thompson's permanent removal, a complete overhaul of the school's discrimination reporting system, and the establishment of a permanent student-parent oversight committee for hiring and curriculum decisions. As the lights came up, the reaction was immediate and intense. Parents began sharing their own stories, realizing their children's experiences weren't isolated incidents. Students who had remained silent before found courage in the collective voice of their peers. Principal Davis attempted to regain control of the situation. "We appreciate the student's perspective," he began, but was interrupted by a parent standing up. "These aren't perspectives," the parent called out. "These are documented facts. We have evidence of harassment, grade peering, and attempted blackmail. When are you calling the police?" The school board representative present, Mrs. Chun, took the microphone. "In light of this evidence, we will be launching a full investigation with the assistance of state education authorities. Mr. Thompson's administrative leave will be extended indefinitely." But the students weren't satisfied with just promises. They had learned from experience that words needed to be backed by action. Jamal and Aisha presented a detailed implementation plan for their demands, complete with timelines and accountability measures. "We're not asking anymore," Jamal declared to thunderous applause. "We're demanding change, and we have the evidence to support why it's necessary." The investigation into Thompson's conduct moved with unprecedented speed. Within days, state education officials descended on Riverside High, armed with the students' meticulously gathered evidence. The investigative team set up in the library, conducting interviews and reviewing documents from early morning until late evening. Thompson's personnel file revealed a history of complaints that had been buried or dismissed. The investigators discovered that previous administrators had moved him between different schools in the district rather than addressing the issues. Each transfer had been accompanied by carefully worded recommendations that avoided mentioning problems while simultaneously shifting responsibility. During his suspension, Thompson made a critical error. He attempted to access the school's computer system remotely, triggering security protocols that tracked his activities. The IT department discovered he had been systematically deleting emails and altering digital records for months. This goes beyond discriminatory behavior, the lead investigator announced during a closed-door meeting with the school board. We're looking at potential criminal charges for tampering with educational records, harassment, and misuse of confidential student information. Meanwhile, Angela's leadership transformed from reactive to proactive. She worked with a diverse committee of parents, students, and supportive faculty to develop new school policies. The changes were comprehensive. Mandatory quarterly reviews of grade distributions across demographic groups, anonymous reporting systems with guaranteed investigation timelines, required cultural competency training for all staff. Led by experts in educational equity, student-parent committees with real power in hiring decisions, curriculum review panels ensuring diverse perspectives in course materials. The school's atmosphere began to shift. Teachers who had previously stayed silent about discrimination started speaking up. Several approached Angela with their own documentation of problematic patterns they'd observed, but had been afraid to report. Principal Davis, recognizing the changing tide, became an unexpected ally. "I failed these students," he admitted during a staff meeting. "We all failed them by allowing this culture to persist. But we have an opportunity now to build something better." The transformation wasn't without resistance. Some veteran teachers complained about excessive oversight and political correctness gone too far. A small group of parents threatened to transfer their children to private schools, claiming the new policies would lower standards. But the data told a different story. As the new policies took effect, academic performance improved across all demographic groups. Students reported feeling more engaged in classes where their perspectives were valued. Teacher evaluations became more thorough and constructive. Angela worked with the administration to create a new position, Director of Equity and Inclusion. The role would have real authority, including the power to review hiring decisions and curriculum changes. When the position was advertised, they received applications from experienced educators across the country. The students continued their involvement, but in a more structured way. A Student Equity Council was formed, with representatives from every grade level and demographic group. They met regularly with administration and had a direct line to the school board. Jamal and Aisha, now seen as leaders rather than victims, trained younger students to recognize and document discrimination. "We're building a legacy," Aisha told a group of freshmen. "What happened to us shouldn't happen to anyone else." From his forced isolation, Thompson launched what would become his final offensive against Riverside High. Through his lawyer, he threatened a defamation lawsuit against Angela, Jamal, and several other students who had spoken out. The legal documents arrived at their homes via certified mail, thick envelopes designed to intimidate. "Your son's allegations have caused irreparable damage to my client's reputation," the lawyer's letter stated. "We demand immediate retraction of all statements and compensation for emotional distress." The lawsuit sought $2.5 million in damages and threatened to expose embarrassing personal details about the families involved. Angela, however, had anticipated this move. She had already connected with the ACLU and several civil rights organizations that specialized in educational discrimination cases. Within hours of receiving Thompson's threat, she had assembled a team of pro bono attorneys ready to countersue. "He's trying to silence us with fear," Angela told the worried parents gathered in her living room. "But everything we've said is documented. Truth is our strongest defense." She spread out their evidence files, showing how each allegation against Thompson was supported by multiple sources of proof. Thompson's threats took an uglier turn when he began posting personal information about Angela online. He created social media accounts using pseudonyms to share details about her divorce from 10 years ago, her financial struggles as a single mother, and even Jamal's medical history. The post suggested that Angela was exploiting the situation for personal gain. The community's response was swift and overwhelming. Parents and students organized a digital safety team, reporting the harmful posts and documenting every instance of harassment. Local tech professionals volunteered their time to trace the posts back to Thompson's home IP address, providing crucial evidence for the ongoing investigation. "We protect our own" became the rallying cry as families worked together to counter Thompson's attacks. When he targeted one family, others would step in to provide support, whether legal, emotional, or practical. The solidarity Thompson tried to break only grew stronger under pressure. The situation reached a critical point when Thompson appeared unexpectedly at a local coffee shop where Angela was meeting with parents. He approached their table, phone recording, and began making accusations about their conspiracy against him. The incident, captured on the cafe's security cameras and multiple phone videos, showed Thompson growing increasingly agitated while Angela remained calm. "Everything we've said about you is true, Mr. Thompson," Angela stated clearly, looking directly at his phone camera. "And every action you take now just proves our point." Her composed response, contrasting sharply with his aggressive behavior, quickly went viral on local social media. The school board called an emergency meeting to address Thompson's escalating behavior. During the session, more evidence emerged. Thompson had been contacting other teachers, pressuring them to speak against the student movement. Several teachers came forward with screenshots of his messages, showing how he tried to orchestrate opposition to the new equity policies. Angela used this latest development to push for stronger protective measures. "This isn't just about our families anymore," she argued before the board. "This is about protecting ever. Why students' right to speak up without fear of retaliation." The meeting concluded with a unanimous vote to involve law enforcement. Thompson's actions had crossed from professional misconduct into criminal harassment, and the board could no longer treat this as merely an internal school matter. The end of Thompson's campaign came swiftly and decisively. The school board, armed with overwhelming evidence of harassment, intimidation, and record tampering, voted unanimously for his termination. The decision was announced during a packed board meeting, where Thompson's final appeal was rejected in a public forum. Based on the extensive documentation provided, the board president declared, "Mr. Thompson's actions represent gross professional misconduct, creating a hostile educational environment and engaging in retaliatory behavior against students and parents." The formal termination letter included 37 pages of documented incidents, each meticulously cross-referenced with supporting evidence. Thompson's response was immediate but ineffective. His lawyer withdrew from the defamation case after reviewing the school's counter-evidence, leaving Thompson to face multiple civil suits without legal representation. The criminal investigation into his harassment and record tampering continued, with the district attorney's office expressing strong interest in pursuing charges. Meanwhile, Jamal's role in the school underwent a remarkable transformation. The boy who had once sat quietly in the front row, enduring subtle discrimination, was now addressing the school board about implementing new equity policies. His presentation on creating an anonymous reporting system received district-wide attention, with other schools requesting permission to adopt the model. What began with spilled coffee, Jamal told the assembled students during a leadership conference, exposed years of systematic discrimination. But more importantly, it showed us our own power to create change. His words resonated beyond Riverside High, inspiring student activists across the district. Angela's contribution was formally recognized when she was offered a permanent position as the district's first director of educational equity and justice. The role came with significant authority to implement and oversee anti-discrimination policies across all schools in the district. Her first action was to establish a parent-student oversight committee with real power in hiring and curriculum decisions. The school itself underwent a profound transformation. The new history teacher who replaced Thompson, Dr. Maria Rodriguez, brought a fresh approach to teaching American history, incorporating diverse perspectives and encouraging critical discussions. Student participation soared, and AP History enrollment among minority students doubled the following year. Aisha, inspired by the movement she helped build, announced her intention to study civil rights law. "We learned that justice requires both voice and evidence," she said during her college admission interview. "It's not enough to know you're right. You have to prove it systematically." The documentary, created by the students, became required viewing for teacher training throughout the district. Its raw honesty and detailed documentation served as both a warning and a guide for educators, demonstrating how subtle discrimination can escalate and how it can be effectively challenged. In the final week of the school year, Angela and Jamal stood together at a community celebration marking the official adoption of the new district-wide equity policies. The event wasn't just about their victory over discrimination. It was about the lasting changes they had created. "This was never just about one teacher or one incident," Angela addressed the crowd. "It was about transforming a system that allowed discrimination to flourish in silence. Today, we've created something that will protect generations of students to come." Jamal okayed out at the gathered community. Students, parents, teachers, and administrators united in purpose. He realized that what had started with a painful incident had evolved into something far more significant, a blueprint for change that others could follow. The story of Riverside High became a case study in educational reform, demonstrating how documented evidence, organized resistance, and persistent advocacy could transform an entire educational system. What Thompson had intended as acts of intimidation had instead catalyzed a movement for lasting change, proving that sometimes the most powerful reforms begin with the smallest incidents.